If I may ask everyone to please rise, we will be reading through Genesis chapter 29, and this will be our main text. But I will be reading only part of it from verses 1 up to verse 14, and the rest we will be reading it along the way. Verse 1, Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east. He looked and saw a well in a field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it. For from that well they watered the flocks. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. Jacob said to them, My brothers, where are you from? And they said, We are from Haran. He said to them, Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said to them, Is it well with him? And they said, It is well. And here is Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep. He said, Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered. Water the sheep and go pasture them. But they said, We cannot until all the flocks are gathered. And they rolled the stone from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. So when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Then he related to Laban all these things. Laban said to him, Surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him a month. You may take your seats. 3 points. Love at first sight. What goes around comes around. And lastly, God's unfailing love. Since we are still in the love month, Feb 23, di ba? We see another love story brewing in this chapter. Now, if you still remember in my last sermon, in Genesis 24, the beautiful love story of Isaac and Rebekah. It's actually a representation of the love story between Christ and His church. And today, we will be seeing another love story. Yun nga lang, sadly, unlike the last time, there will be no happy ending. What we will witness in this chapter today is how God dealt with Jacob for his past mistakes. Now, remember when Jacob took advantage of Esau by duping him of his birthright? Naalala niyo pa yun? And then later on, with the help of his mom, deceived his father Isaac by disguising himself as Esau, and as a result, receiving the blessing of Isaac. That Isaac actually wanted to give it to whom? To Esau. Pero yun, mali din yun, di ba? And yet, nakita naman natin ginawa ni Jacob, still did what is not according to the plan of God. And what we will see today and in the coming weeks are the consequences of his wrongdoings. So going now to our main text in verse 1, Jacob continued on with his journey to the land of the sons of the east. No? It is, ano ba yun? Saan ba yan? The land is actually Haran, where his uncle Laban was. Now this was right after him dreaming about a ladder. If you still remember Jacob's ladder, where angels were ascending and descending on it. And then after which he made a pillar of stone to remind him of God's promise to him. But the reason why he had to go to his uncle in Haran, which was actually about 600 miles away from Canaan, and then he had to leave his parents and even the comfort that comes with it, this was actually triggered by what his mom heard from the grapevine of about his brother's evil plot against him. If you go to Genesis 27, verses 41 to 43, it says here, So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." Now when the words of her elder son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent and called her younger son, Jacob, and said to him, "Behold, your brother Esau is consoling himself concerning you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice and arise, flee to Haran to my brother Laban." You see, Jacob had no choice but to leave the comforts of his home because of what he did. No? May mali siyang ginawa and suffer the consequence of that. But what we saw in the previous chapter, in chapter 28, we actually see there is what? God's grace and sovereignty at work in the life of Jacob. And we see now that happening again in this chapter. You see, Jacob's mistakes were never a hindrance or a stumbling block for God to fulfill his will in Jacob's life. God actually even reminded him in a dream of the promise that he had given his grandfather Abraham. And this is one attribute of God that has been constantly shown to us in the book of Genesis. No, starting from the fall of man and up to now. And what is that? His grace. His abounding grace. And that is what we are going to see as we continue on in this chapter. And it is my prayer that we not only see how God disciplines his own, but also see his unfailing love to those who would call upon him. So going back to our main text, Jacob finally arrived in Haran in verse 1. And then in verse 2 it says, "He looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it. For from that well they watered the flocks. Now the stone of the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well." Ang sabi rito, Jacob saw a well with 3 flocks of sheep lying there beside it. And there was a stone, a huge stone covering the mouth of the well. It was large, yun ang description dito. No, it was so large that it had to take these shepherds to roll the stone away from the mouth of the well. Now, surely there's a reason why the author had to mention how large the stone was. And I'll share that with you in a bit. Let's go to verse 4. It says here, "Jacob said to them, 'My brothers, where are you from?' And they said, 'We are from Haran.' He said to them, 'Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?' And they said, 'We know him.' And he said to them, 'Is it well with him?' And they said, 'It is well.' And here is Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep." Now, if you remember in Genesis chapter 24, Eliezer, Abraham's chief servant, he was also near a well when he saw Rebekah coming to fill up her jar with water. Naalala niyo pa yan? And I can't help but ask, why were these romantic scenes always set near or beside a well? No? Why is it beside a well ang setting parate? Now, what's with the well back then? That people would just go around and basically hang around. I think it was because during those days, especially in that part of the world, water was a difficult commodity. Now, it was a difficult commodity. And that is why the wells then were a common place that people would naturally gather around. And they would talk as they get water for themselves and for their animals. And if you remember again in Genesis 24, it said there that women were always the ones who would go there to get water for their homes. And in some cases, like now in verse 29, like Rachel, who was a shepherdess, she would go there to give water for her sheep. And that is also why I believe that men would also go there and look for prospects. No? It now becomes a place for wife hunting. Going now to verse 7, he said, "Behold, it is still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered. Water the sheep and go pasture them." But they said, "We cannot, until all the flocks are gathered and they roll the stone from the mouth of the well, then we water the sheep." Now look at what Jacob was trying to do. Look at what he was trying to do. You see, when he saw Rachel coming, immediately he tried to convince the other shepherds to get out of his sight. Now yun ang sinasabi ni Jacob dito sa mga pastol na ito. And why was he doing that? Because he wanted to be left alone with Rachel. It was like saying, do what you need to do now and go. Take a hike. Remember, Jacob was he was actually the new guy in town. Baguhan lang siya rito. And yet you see how assertive he was to these shepherds. Talk about character. Medyo nakikita na natin kung ano ang karakter nitong taong ito. But the shepherds replied, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered and they roll the stone from the mouth of the well and then we water the sheep." You see, not only was it a waste of time to open and close that huge stone cover more than once, but it was because it was heavy, mabigat. And that is why it is wiser to wait for the other flocks to come and then water them all at the same time. And if you do that, you basically save time and energy. But look at what happened next in verse 9. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now, ito yung part na gusto ko. Now, if this were a movie scene, this scene would be one of the highlights. No? This is the part where everything begins to move in slow motion. And then you hear the theme song now is being played, no, on the background. And then you'll see Rachel with her hair bouncing and swaying along in the wind. And she was walking towards the well, and then suddenly she turns her eyes towards Jacob, and their eyes meet. And Rachel smiled, and Jacob smiled back. Na-imagine niyo yung ano na yun? Wala yan sa Bible, ha? Not even the commentaries. It's my own commentary, okay? Just to make sure that you guys will stay awake. But look at what Jacob did in verse 10. It says here, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled a stone from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Now, what do we call this in Tagalog? May kasabihan tayo dito sa Tagalog. Ano itong ginagawa ni Jacob? Nagpapakitang gilas. No, pakitang gilas, or in a more layman's term, nagpapapogi points. No? Papogi points siya. Folks, you have to know that at this point, Jacob was already in his 70s. Yeah, you heard me right. He was already in his 70s. No, nag-uumpisa pa lang siyang ma-in love. 70s na. Anyway. Now, he was not a young man in his 20s or in his 30s as many of us would think. Because if you remember towards the end of chapter 26, Esau, Jacob's twin, no, got married to a Hittite woman at the age of 40. No, Esau was 40 then in chapter 26. So ilang taon na rin si Jacob nung panahon na yun? 40 rin. No, and it took another 3 decades, no, before Jacob left for Haran, here in chapter 29. Now, if you're asking for a supporting verse on that, there's none. It's just that the Bible scholars, through the significant events, no, or in the timeline of the Genesis narrative, they unanimously came up with a computation that Jacob was already in his 70s when he met Rachel. Now, some of us would think, how could Jacob have done that? No, paano niya nagawa yun? Considering his age. He was already in his 70s. Well, let me share with you a couple of reasons. One, during those days, there were no preservatives. Walang preservatives. And the reason why people during the time live much longer is because everything they eat is organic. Natural lahat, no? And most men don't need to go to the gym to buff themselves up. Because during those days, everything was done manually. And most men would do the harder or the much difficult work, either at home or even in the workplace. And then secondly, a person who is love-struck, no, I know the men, sigurado na experience to. A person who is love-struck at that very moment can do things almost supernaturally. Tama ba ako? Yung babae ang nag-yes eh, hindi yung lalaki. You see, I remember when Ovi and I were working abroad, magkasama kami sa isang kumpanya. We worked in the factory, and there were times that the men would carry stuff on their shoulders, and they would carry it from one place to another. And I would intentionally, listen to this, I would intentionally double what the other guys were carrying whenever my OV is around. Show off. And I'm trying to impress her. But sadly, tanungin niyo siya ngayon, wala siyang maalala nun. Hindi nga niya napansin eh. Now, what I just said a while ago were mere speculations. They are mere speculations. But one thing is certain, is that Jacob was love-struck when he saw Rachel. It was love at first sight. It was love at first sight. Go to verse 11. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. Now, some of you might be thinking, ano ba naman to? Napaka-OA naman ni Jacob. Now, the kissing on the cheek, I believe, was part of their customary greeting. But to lift up your voice and weep, man, that is something else. It was something else. Jacob was probably so overwhelmed with emotions that he can't control his feelings. Kaya napaiyak siya. Napahagulgul siya sa tuwa. And with that being said, we can say that Jacob was pretty much an emotional guy. No? He was an emotional guy. Going now to verse 12 to 14, Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. So when Laban heard the news of Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Then he related to Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. Now, when Jacob told Rachel who he was, anong ginawa ni Rachel? She quickly ran to his father. And probably she told his father, "Dad, there was this guy who, when he saw me, he told me that he was your relative, and he kissed me, and then he wept so loud." Now, this guy is something else, Dad. He's weird. And he's coming to see you. But you know what? Laban actually welcomed him warmly because Jacob was his nephew. No, pamangkin niya eh. The son of his younger sister Rebekah, whom he has not seen for years. Now, I want you to take notice on the last sentence of verse 13. It says there, "Then he related to Laban all these things." Now, Jacob basically told Laban the reason why he left his parents and came to Haran to see him. Meaning he told Laban about what happened between him and Esau regarding the birthright and when he deceived his dad or his father Isaac in order to get his blessing. And look at how Laban replied after he said that. Ano yung reply ni Laban? "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." Now, you might say, he's just stating a fact. No, wala namang mali sa dun. Wala namang mali dun eh. Pamangkin naman niya talaga yon. Jacob was his nephew. But I hope you're seeing this. I hope you're seeing this. Because it was after Jacob told him about his cheating and deception that Laban said, surely you are my bone and my flesh. It's like Laban saying, like uncle, like nephew. You see, Laban, like Jacob, was also a schemer and a deceiver. Do you still remember the reason why Laban welcomed a total stranger in the person of Eliezer? In Genesis 24, let us go there. In Genesis 24, verse 29 to 31. Now Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban, and Laban ran outside to the man at the spring. When he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's wrists, and when he heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, saying, this is what the man said to me. He went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. And he said, come in, blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside, since I prepared the house and the place for the camels? Now you see how he treated Eliezer. Nakita niyo kung paano tratuhin ni Jacob si Eliezer. Ni Laban si Eliezer. He was not even sure if Eliezer was legit or not. But because he saw the rings and the bracelets, because he saw the camels and the gifts that were on the camels, he calls Eliezer blessed of the Lord. Nakita niyo kung paano mag-isip itong si Laban? If you think Jacob was a master deceiver, wait till you hear what Laban is going to do next. And what we will see next actually is the consequence of Jacob's wrongdoings. And this is God's way of disciplining him. If you go to verse 15, our next point. Then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? Now, for the first time in the narratives of Jacob, he becomes the object of deception rather than being the source. You see, Laban turned the tables on him. The similarity between between what Laban did to Jacob and what Jacob did to Isaac is quite obvious. It is quite obvious. Jacob was able to exchange the younger for the older, whereas Laban reverses the trick and exchanges the older for the younger. And you'll see that later. What goes around comes around. And since Jacob has been staying there for a month now, Laban asked him, not because you are my relative doesn't mean that you should work for nothing. What shall your wages be? Kumbaga sinasabi ni Laban, name your price. And probably Jacob took this as an opportunity to get what he really came for. Rachel, whom he loved the most. But it also says here that Laban had two daughters. He had two daughters. The oldest being Leah and the youngest being Rachel. And look at how they were described in verses 16 and 17. Now Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful of form and face. Now that alone says it all. And it is understandable why Jacob fell in love with Rachel and not Leah. Because Rachel does not only possess a beautiful form, but also what? A beautiful face. Pang beauty queen yung kagandahan nitong si Rachel. While Leah, poor Leah, no? Leah's eyes were weak. Now it could be an eye defect or a pale colored eye. Not like the dark-colored, sparkling eyes. You see, paleness in their eyes in those days were also considered a blemish. No, it is a blemish. Now look at how Jacob now responded to Laban's question regarding his wages. In verse 18, now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. Now this was indeed a handsome offer coming from Jacob. he wants to make sure that Laban could not refuse his offer, that he would not refuse his offer. And true enough, he got a positive answer from Laban. If you go to verse 19 and 20, Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to give her to another man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. 7 years seemed but a few days for him. That was how much in love Jacob was with Rachel. Ganun siya ka-in love. Probably it was because Jacob sees her every day while he's working, and that is why he never noticed the days going by. And that is why 7 years is like only a few days for him. Now, it says here, after 7 years, the day has come for him to collect his wages. Now we go to verse 21. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my time is completed that I may go into her." Ganun ka-literal, ha? Now, Jacob said this in a demanding tone. So, medyo may pagka-demanding tone siya. Well, you worked for 7 years. No, it's but right that you have to collect your wages. But you know what? If I were Laban, he'll surely receive a mouthful from me. Makakarinig sa akin yan. Yabang mo, ha? But you know what? I think by this time, we all know that Laban had already hatched out a plan to trick Jacob. And instead of giving Rachel to him in marriage, we know what happened. He gave him Leah instead. And the outcome was what? Jacob had to work for him for another 7 years. How did he do that? How did Laban do that? Go to verse 22. Laban gathered all the men of the place and made a feast. Now in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him. And Jacob went into her. Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came about in the morning that behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served with you? Why then have you deceived me?" Again, what goes around comes around. Or should I say, what you sow is what you will reap. And this is exactly what happened to Jacob. But at this point, I don't think he sees that this is a discipline of God upon him. Instead, he felt cheated. He was even adamant of what Laban did to him, not thinking that he was also like that. You know what? Sometimes we're like Jacob too. Diba? We are so quick to judge others when we ourselves are guilty of it also. Now, when we talk about wedding, definitely there is a wedding feast. Diba? And when we talk about feasts, people would be feasting not only with food, but also with wine. You eat and drink till you drop. And since it was already evening, and Jacob was drunk, it was so easy for Jacob to mistook Leah for Rachel. And that is exactly what Laban did. He took advantage of the situation. And he executed the plan to deceive Jacob. Imagine waking up, realizing that you slept with the wrong woman. And this is exactly what happened to Jacob. What goes around comes around. A con artist being conned by a fellow con artist. If you go to verse 26 to 30, but Laban said, "It is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also for the service which you shall serve with me for another 7 years." Jacob did so and completed her week, and he gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. Laban also gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her maid. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served with Laban for another 7 years. Anong sagot dito ni Laban? It is not the practice in our place to marry off the younger before the firstborn. I could imagine Jacob telling him, and then you're telling me this now? You're telling me this now? Ba't ngayon mo lang sinabi? Sana nung una pa lang sinabi mo na. But before we even go further, I'm sure some of you might be wondering, was polygamy allowed during the days of Jacob? No. Is it allowed during the days of Jacob, having 2 or more wives? No, allowed ba talaga yan? No. Firstly, I think it's quite clear to us, because we have already gone through Genesis chapter 2, that God does not allow polygamy. He does not allow polygamy. If you go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, it says there, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Now you leave your father and mother and be joined to your wives? No, to your wife. Singular. Isa lang. Which means that from the very start, God is against polygamy. He is against polygamy. And secondly, since the book of Genesis is a narrative, it doesn't mean that we are to follow the example of Jacob for having multiple wives or concubines. Now, if I may refresh your mind, ilang beses na rin sinabi ito ng mga preachers natin, a narrative is only a narration or an explanation of what had already transpired. And therefore, we are not to take it as something that is being prescribed for us to follow or to imitate. No, descriptive ito. Ipinapaliwanag, ipinapakita kung ano ang nangyari. Not prescriptive. And lastly, I'm sure the husbands would agree to this. One wife is already too much. And you want more? Hey, di pa ako tapos. When I said too much, we already experienced too much love and care and thoughtfulness from them. Hindi pa ba enough yun? Di ba? Okay, kasi baka magalit yung mga wives sa akin mamaya. Now, I'm quite sure there are consequences for that type of sin. You see, Jacob must have some bouts of migraine or headache just trying to appease his conflicting wives and concubines, or even his children. And balancing his time with them would definitely be an issue also. And therefore, polygamy then and now is against the commands of God, and therefore it is sin. It is sin. Going back to our main text, it was quite clear that Laban was really intent in duping his nephew. 7 years of service for a bride was already a generous offer coming from Jacob. But that was never enough for Laban. And Laban even asked for another 7 years of service for Rachel. Do you see how cunning and scheming this guy was? And you think Laban would stop at that? Of course not. Of course not. He would have wanted Jacob to stay with him and serve him for the rest of his life. And you will see that because when Jacob and his family secretly left Laban after serving him for 20 years, you would still see him pursuing them, not wanting to release them. If you go to Genesis 31, verses 41 to 42, "These 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac has not been for me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God has seen my affliction and the toil of my hands, so he rendered judgment last night." Now, what Jacob went through with Laban was actually a dose of his own medicine. It was a dose of his own medicine. And Jacob had to serve Laban for how many years? According to this passage, 20 years. No? Before he was released. Actually, he was not released. He and his family had to escape from the clutches of Laban. They have to escape. Now, is this a discipline coming from God? I believe so. I truly believe so. Because like what Proverbs said in chapter 3, verse 12, "For whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects the son in whom he delights." Beloved, you cannot outsmart God. You cannot outsmart God. Now, if you think that you can get away with everything, my friend, you better think twice. You have to think twice. Because if you are indeed a child of God, ang sabi ng Bible, you will surely be disciplined for the mistakes that you did in this life. You will be disciplined by God. And this is exactly what is happening to Jacob. If you now go to Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, it says here, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this he will also reap." Beloved, there are consequences to the sins that we do. There are consequences to the sins that we do. Now, you may not experience the consequence in your lifetime, but those after you may suffer. They may suffer. We've seen that in Abraham. When he agreed to sleep with her wife's maid Hagar, which bore them Ishmael, to which his descendants up to this very day has been a pain in the neck for the Israelites. Brethren, there are consequences to the sins that we do, or that we did, and that we are still doing, and that we are going to do in the future. May mga consequences yan. If you sow evil, you will reap evil. Last point, God's unfailing love. Verse 31, "Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." Now if you look at the love story of the patriarchs, it was Abraham and Sarah, and then Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and Rachel. But why not Leah? Why not Leah? Wasn't Leah considered as the first wife of Jacob? Yeah, he was deceived in marrying Leah, but does she deserve to be treated that way? To be used and yet unloved? Now, what reminded me in this incident with Leah was a time when Hagar escaped from her mistress Sarah in Genesis chapter 16. She was pregnant then, and she was maltreated by Sarah and then unloved by Abraham. And Leah, just like Hagar, at this point in time, was unloved by Jacob. Now, the Hebrew translation for the word unloved meant hated or to hate. So what Scripture is basically saying is that Jacob hated Leah. He hated Leah. And yet, what is so surprising is that Jacob would still sleep with her and have children. Do you know how many kids did Jacob had with Leah? 7. 6 boys and 1 girl. Yung babae si Dinah. But folks, what comforts me the most in this verse is to know that God knows what was happening to Leah. If you go to Genesis 29:32, it says there, "Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben. For she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me." Leah was longing for the love of her husband Jacob. And probably she was praying to God for it every day. She was praying for it every day. And by giving him a son, Leah thought that this would somehow compel her husband to love her. But it never came. It never came. If you now go to verse 33 and 34, then she conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. So she named him Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was named Levi. First son came, still unloved. Second son came, still unloved. You would think by the third time the tables would turn, but sadly, Leah was still unloved. And going now to our last verse in verse 35. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Beloved, Leah never became bitter against God. She even named her youngest son Judah, meaning what? Meaning praise. Now, after giving birth to Judah, she was praising the Lord. She said, this time I will praise the Lord. You know what? I truly believe Leah was a believer. She was a believer. Her actions clearly shows of her love and trust for the Lord. Her difficult circumstances did not become a hindrance for her to continually trust in her God. Beloved, as we end, there are 3 lessons that we learned about God in the life of Jacob. One is that God is sovereign in everything. Because like Jacob, who did things that are against the will of God, when he cheated on Esau and deceived Isaac, you know what? God's promise to him remained steadfast. His promise to Jacob remained steadfast. It did not change. Hindi nagbago. Even when things seems going the wrong way, God was still in control. He was still in control. Jacob's boo-boo was never a hindrance for God to fulfill his will in Jacob's life. It was never a hindrance. Secondly, God is just. He is just. When Jacob left Canaan and thought that he has gotten away with what he did, what he actually didn't know was that he was heading towards the discipline of God. Beloved, don't think that you can sin and get away with it. Yes, you probably can get away with it in the eyes of men, but not with our God. Not with God. The Bible says you reap what you sow. If you sow evil, you will reap evil also. Always remember that we have a just God. And lastly, we've learned of God's unfailing love. Even though Jacob did not love Leah, God's unfailing love was always there for Leah. It was always there for Leah. He saw Leah at her darkest moment. He knows her sufferings, and he sees her affliction. And God was with her. God even blessed her by opening up her womb. And she had the most children among the wives and the concubines of Jacob. And it was from her womb that the kingly line came, from the line of Judah. Because the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Lord Jesus Christ, was a direct descendant of Judah. Did you see how God had blessed her? Beloved, the example of Leah is something that is worth emulating. Instead of being bitter against her husband or against her sister, she chose to suffer silently and trusted everything to the Lord. To the point that she was even praising God for her afflictions, for her difficult situation. Now, I don't know where you're at today in your life. Now, your spouse might have been neglecting you, that you feel unloved and uncared for. Or for some of you, you feel that your parents are not giving you enough time and you're tempted to do something that would hurt them. Or you feel like the whole world is so against you and you just want to give up on life. Beloved, you are not alone in this. God sees your affliction. He knows what you are going through in this life. Remember that we have an omniscient God. You can choose to trust God and even praise Him in the midst of your suffering. Remember, God loved us to the point that He gave us His only begotten Son to die for our sakes. And that is the example that we have to follow as a true disciple of Christ, as a true Christian. If you go to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 to 24, it says here, "For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in His steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in His mouth. And while being reviled, He did not revile in return. While suffering, He uttered no threats, but kept entrusting Himself to Him who judges righteously. And He Himself bore our sins in His body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness, for by His wounds you were healed." Beloved, ultimately, God's unfailing love is manifested in no one else but the Lord Jesus Christ. The only one who has committed no sin, died for sins once and for all, so that we might also die to sin and live to be with our Heavenly Father. Let me end by reading our scripture reading for today, Psalm 36, because this had truly encouraged me a lot, especially during my darkest moments, and I hope that this could encourage you as well. Psalm 36, 5 to 9. "Your loving kindness, O Lord, extends to the heavens. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God. Your judgments are like a great deep. O Lord, you preserve man and beast. How precious is your loving kindness, O God, and the children of men take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They drink their fill of the abundance of your house, and you give them to drink of the river of your delights. For with you is a fountain of life. In your light we see light." Let us pray. Father, we are indeed humbled by these truths that we heard from you today. Now, if we are offended by it, then it only shows that we have understood the lessons that you want us to learn. And that is why we ask, O Lord, that you help us through your Holy Spirit, that we may be able to live out all of these lessons that we heard from you today. And may our lives truly be a reflection of Christ to the people around us, and even to those who do not know Christ. Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Have a blessed day, everyone.